In an era where depression is widely understood as a biochemical phenomenon fueled by neurochemical imbalances and external triggers such as stress, trauma, or exhaustion, a deeper layer often goes unnoticed. And it is precisely here that Carl Gustav Jung's perspective begins. Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist and one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century, proposed something bold: that many conditions we now call depression are not failures of the organism, but signs of the soul. They are not diseases that need to be cured, but messages that need to be heard. He referred to this phenomenon as neurosis of meaninglessness, an emotional collapse that does not arise from a damaged mind, but from a life disconnected from its essential truth. People who live for years following others' goals, imposed values, social obligations, inherited roles, eventually reach a point where something inside them simply stops. There is no energy, no enthusiasm, no desire. And contrary to what many think, this is not a defect, it is a refusal. The psyche is rejecting an existence that does not correspond to its personal myth, what Jung described as the unique narrative that each individual is destined to live. This is an uncomfortable idea, because it forces a re-evaluation of one's own life, professional success, stable relationships, a well-planned routine. All of this may be perfectly in order, and yet the soul may be in mourning, because living someone else's myth, even competently, is to die inside every day, and the body responds with exhaustion, apathy, discouragement, not because it is broken, but because it is trying to protect the little truth that still remains inside. Jung observed that in the first half of life, society teaches us to seek the external, recognition, stability, image. But there comes a moment, often subtle, silent, even cruel, when the unconscious demands another path, the path of individuation, a profound process of alignment with the true self, where the person needs to shed the masks and face who they really are. And when this call is ignored, the consequence comes disguised as depression. But what is dying, in fact, is merely the persona, the false self constructed to please the world. This video is an invitation to look at depression with new eyes, not as a sentence, but as a symptom of a course deviation, a legitimate manifestation of the soul saying, "You are living the wrong life." Here, we will explore this idea based on Jung's writings, especially in the work The Development of Personality, and show how reconnecting with purpose can not only alleviate symptoms, but awaken a new way of existing, a more real way, more whole, more yours. If this introduction has already touched something within you, continue. Perhaps the answer you seek is not in silencing the pain, but in finally listening to it. The greatest tragedy of modern life is not failure, it is empty success. It is reaching the top of the ladder and realizing that it was leaning against the wrong wall. And this emptiness, although disguised by achievements, stability, and recognition, is one of the deepest triggers of what is called existential depression, which Jung saw not as a dysfunction, but as a reflection of the disconnection between the social ego and the deep self. For much of life, we are shaped to fit in. From childhood, we are programmed to meet expectations, from parents, from school, from culture, from society. This programming creates what Jung called the persona, the social mask we wear to be accepted. There is nothing wrong with it. It is necessary. But the problem arises when we confuse this mask with who we really are. When we spend decades cultivating an identity built to please others, to fit into systems, to fulfill roles we did not consciously choose. The result? A functional life on the outside, and absolutely desolate on the inside. This is where the concept of the personal myth emerges. For Jung, every human being carries within them a unique narrative, a symbolic journey that needs to be lived for, there to be fulfillment. This story is not dictated by manuals nor by ready-made formulas. It reveals itself in spontaneous passions, ignored talents, repressed desires, in dreams that repeat night after night. When we ignore this internal call and choose to follow someone else's myth, the path expected by parents, the idealized model by society, the script of another's life, the self begins to react. First, with subtle restlessness, then with crises, and finally, with collapse. This collapse is what many call depression, but it is not necessarily a chemical collapse. It is a symbolic collapse, a disconnection from vital energy that occurs when the soul no longer sees meaning in the theater being staged. And the most ironic thing is that, on the outside, everything seems fine. Life is in place, but inside, something essential has been lost. Authenticity. The individual begins to feel that, despite being surrounded by everything that should bring satisfaction, life has lost its color, rhythm, and purpose. Waking up becomes a burden, working a dull obligation, relating a mechanical act, not because they are sick, but because they are absent from themselves. This disconnection is dangerous precisely because it is silent. It does not explode, it dissolves. And the more the person tries to compensate with more achievements, the deeper the hole becomes. It is a cycle that feeds the false self while suffocating the true one. But how to perceive this abyss before it becomes a total collapse? How to identify the signs that we are living someone else's myth? This is what we will talk about next. The silent symptoms of a soul in rebellion. When the unconscious begins to protest, the body feels, the mind responds, and life begins to crumble from within. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Not all pain is noise. Some pains are language. And, according to Jung, many symptoms that are quickly labeled as depressive today are, in fact, sophisticated ways for the unconscious to try to make itself heard. When a person begins to radically distance themselves from their purpose, their personal myth, their deepest truth, the self reacts. And this reaction is not, as many believe, a pathological collapse, but a legitimate protest of the soul. This protest, however, rarely presents itself as a clear cry. It comes disguised, in the form of apathy, constant exhaustion, loss of interest in everything that was once significant. The world loses its color, days seem mechanical, interactions become superficial, and a deep existential fatigue takes over. It is not physical fatigue, it is an exhaustion of the soul. A sign that the whole being is resisting living a story that is not theirs. Jung believed that when the ego, our everyday consciousness, comes into conflict with the self, our deepest and most authentic psychic core, the vital energy that should flow naturally becomes fragmented. It is as if a part of us says no to the life we are trying to lead. And in that no, symptoms arise, not as failure, but as symbolic resistance. These symptoms are not limited to the emotional. They can manifest in the body, in sleep, in appetite, in libido, in creativity. Everything that once flowed begins to get stuck. Everything that once sparked curiosity now sounds indifferent. And the most distressing part is that often there is no clear reason. The person looks around and lacks nothing, but inside, everything seems absent. This is the paradox of the neurotic sense of meaninglessness. Jung saw these states as liminal moments, doors to deep psychic transitions. They arise when something in us needs to die for something else to be born. But, out of fear, repression, or social conditioning, we try to silence these signals with distractions, excessive medication, or superficial positivity. We ignore the symptom without listening to what it is trying to communicate. This listening is essential. For when the self begins to protest, It is pointing to a truth that needs to emerge. It may be a talent that has been buried, a vocation abandoned, a life choice made out of fear, not authenticity. The symptom is the clue. The pain is the map. The way out is not to erase these signals, but to understand them. From the moment the individual recognizes that their pain can be a form of wisdom, a cry for reconnection with their true nature, a possibility for real transformation begins. But this transformation does not happen merely with insights. It requires a journey. And this journey has a name in Jungian thought: individuation. In the next section, we will explore this concept deeply and understand why this process is the only real way out when the soul refuses to continue playing roles it did not choose to live. At the center of Jung's psychology is an idea that sounds almost heretical in the face of modern logic. Suffering can be a call to a journey that seeks not only to repair what is broken, but to reveal what is hidden. This journey is the process of individuation. And understanding this concept is essential for those who wish to move beyond the surface of temporary relief and dive into the construction of a life with real meaning. Individuation is not synonymous with individualism. On the contrary, while individualism seeks to separate, affirm the ego, and compete, individuation proposes integration. It is the inner movement of reconnecting with all parts of oneself: light and shadow, reason and instinct, desire and vocation. Jung saw this process as the most important psychological task of adult life, and also the most avoided. Why? Because individuation requires courage. It demands questioning everything that has been passively internalized: family values, cultural standards, societal models of success. Jung asserted that in the first half of life, the ego needs to develop, carve out space in the world, and form identity. But there comes a point, a critical point often marked by crisis, where this is no longer enough. What once worked begins to weigh heavily. What once gave meaning now numbs. What once moved now paralyzes. This is where the call begins. The call of individuation arises as a kind of internal restlessness that cannot be silenced. It may come through recurring dreams, creative impulses, philosophical questions, or even a deep sense of disconnection with one's own life. Nothing seems wrong objectively, but everything feels out of place. This is the moment when the unconscious begins to push the individual out of the persona, the social mask, and demands a reconnection with the self. The self, for Jung, is not just a psychological concept. It is the organizing center of the psyche, the totality of being that knows what we came here to do, even if the ego is still lost. It is like an invisible magnetic field, always pulling consciousness toward wholeness. And when ignored, it begins to manifest in symptoms, dreams, synchronicities, symbolic forms that guide the individual toward their unique path. Individuating is to accept this call. It is to commit to a process of inner excavation where old structures must crumble for something new to emerge. It is to die to the idealized images we create of ourselves and to be reborn in the raw, unstable, and powerful truth of what we really are. And here lies the key. This process is not comfortable. It is not quick. It is not something that can be taught in 3 steps or resolved with motivational phrases. It is a confrontation with everything the ego fears losing. And at the same time, it is the only way to rediscover lost vitality, silent enthusiasm, the feeling of living something that truly makes sense. But where to begin? How to listen to this self that manifests symbolically, not logically? How to decipher the signs of the unconscious when all we have been taught is to ignore it? In the next segment, we will dive into just that, how Jung proposes we reconnect with purpose through active listening to the unconscious, paying attention to dreams, impulses, forgotten memories, and internal signals that point the way back to what is essential. In Jung's thinking, the unconscious is not just a reservoir of repressed impulses or forgotten memories. It is a guide, an internal oracle that, although it speaks in symbols and images, knows precisely the path of the soul. When life loses its meaning, when vital energy dissolves into apathy, it is not the logical mind that can offer the answer. It is the unconscious that holds the map for reconnecting with purpose. And listening to it requires a radical change of attitude, stepping out of control and entering into listening. Jung believed that every person has within them a personal myth, a unique narrative that needs to be discovered and lived. This myth is not revealed in manuals or in others' expectations. It emerges through symbolic fragments, recurring dreams, persistent ideas that do not fade with time, neglected talents that continue to seek space, creative impulses that arise in silence, existential questions that cyclically return, even when we try to ignore them. These elements are, for Jung, direct expressions of the self trying to manifest. When we ignore these calls, out of fear, insecurity, or conformity, the unconscious begins to scream, but its scream is subtle. It comes in the form of demotivation, inexplicable discomfort, a boredom that does not pass, a constant feeling of being out of place, as if we are living in a narrative written by someone else. Listening to the unconscious is the beginning of reconnecting with purpose. And this does not require ready-made answers. It requires a willingness to listen to deep questions. Jung suggested simple yet powerful questions. What in me is trying to be born? What part of me was sacrificed to please others? What kind of suffering would I be willing to fight for because it makes sense to me? What can only I offer to the world, just as I am? These questions do not have immediate answers, but the simple act of formulating them begins to dissolve the rigidity of the ego. Consciousness opens up, dreams gain strength, and the unconscious, realizing it is finally being listened to, begins to collaborate. Dreams are, in this process, a fundamental tool. They are not random absurdities. They are coded messages. Jung saw the dream as a natural production of the psyche that, night after night, tries to compensate for the one-sidedness of the ego. If waking life is pulling you away from the self, dreams will try to pull you back. Paying attention to dream symbols, noting recurring images, reflecting on your strangest emotions. All of this is part of listening. Because the unconscious does not argue, it shows. Another avenue is creative impulses. Many depressed people report a sudden desire to draw, write, play an instrument, move to a new city, learn something seemingly useless. These impulses should not be dismissed as escapes. Often they are the first manifestations of the personal myth trying to express itself after years of repression. And there are also abandoned talents, those things that made sense at some point in life, but were set aside in the name of obligations. Resuming that thread can be the key to reclaiming one's soul. The reconnection with purpose, therefore, does not come from outside. It does not come from self-help books or generic advice. It begins within, in silence, in listening. It is a slow process, yes, uncomfortable often, but deeply transformative. And once this listening begins, something shifts. Life starts to signal. Meaning begins to emerge, not as an explosion of euphoria, but as an internal ember that refuses to extinguish. But what happens when this listening is taken seriously? When a person truly begins to transform their life based on these internal signals? That is where we enter the territory of psychological rebirth. And that is what we will talk about next. How the so-called depression can become the beginning of a new cycle, not of destruction, but of authentic reconstruction. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Most people see depression as an end, the end of energy, motivation, and hope. But for Jung, this dark experience can mark the beginning of something deeply necessary, a process of psychological rebirth. Of course, this rebirth does not happen automatically. It requires awareness, listening, and, above all, a willingness to traverse the darkness with honesty. Because before being reborn, one must die. And what needs to die is the persona, the false self, that disconnected us from our essence. Depression, in this context, can be seen as a kind of descent into the underground of the soul, an archetypal process similar to what ancient myths called catabasis, the hero's journey to the underworld. Just as Orpheus descends to the underworld in search of Eurydice, or as Inanna passes through the gates of the underworld to find her shadow, the individual in existential depression is often unknowingly traversing a deep psychic territory where nothing superficial survives. In this symbolic space, everything that was sustained by conventions, obligations, and self-image begins to crumble. It is a moment of extreme vulnerability. The person feels they have lost all references. The old life no longer makes sense, but the new one has not yet begun. They are on the threshold. This intermediate state is dangerous, but also fertile, because it is in this state that the alchemy of the soul occurs, the transformation of suffering into meaning. Jung saw the transcendent function as the psychic mechanism that enables this rebirth. When the ego sincerely listens to the unconscious, and when there is a true dialogue between reason and intuition, light and shadow, something new can emerge. A new way of being, more integrated, more authentic, more connected to what truly matters. It is not a return to what was before. It is the creation of something unprecedented. This transformation, however, requires that the pain not be denied, nor immediately anesthetized. One must endure the tension, the emptiness, the feeling of disorientation, without trying to escape to quick solutions or ready-made formulas. Because it is precisely at the center of this discomfort that the possibility of finding the lost thread of purpose resides. Many people, as they go through this process, report a curious feeling. The sadness remains, but it gains dignity. The suffering does not disappear immediately, but becomes understandable, directed. It is no longer a bottomless pit, but a path with direction. It is the difference between sinking and diving. In the first, you are swallowed. In the second, you meet something. From the moment this descent is recognized as part of the journey, and not as a mistake to be corrected, the very narrative of life begins to reorganize. The pain becomes part of the soul's biography. The scar becomes a symbol of crossing, and vitality, little by little, returns. Not as artificial euphoria, but as a constant, silent, and steady flame. This flame is the beginning of a new life, a life where purpose is not an abstract ideal but a daily experience, where every choice, every gesture, and every path has a direction that comes from within. But what does it mean, after all, to live from this new place? What is a life guided not by the persona, but by the self? What is it like to exist with meaning, even amidst uncertainty and pain? This is exactly what we will explore in the next and final part, a reflection on what it means, in practice, to live authentically, connected to your personal myth, and why this reconnection is the key to not just survive, but truly live. Reaching the other side of existential pain is not about emerging as a perfect, enlightened, or fully realized person. It is about becoming a true self. Someone who has stopped fleeing from themselves. Someone who, even while still carrying doubts, traumas, and scars, has decided to live with psychological integrity. This is living with purpose. And this is where the Jungian journey materializes. when suffering ceases to be a silent burden and transforms into a compass, pointing every day in the direction of a life that makes sense. Living from the self is not a mystical or unattainable experience. It is practice. It is every day. It is made up of small choices aligned with the personal myth, that symbolic and profound script that only you can live. It is understanding that there are things only you can do the way you do them, and that your existence is justified not by external applause, but by an internal coherence that needs no explanation to anyone. This may mean changing careers, yes, but it may also mean changing your attitude in your current career. It may mean leaving a relationship that drains you, or finally diving in with presence into the one you live superficially. It may mean reclaiming a talent you abandoned at 15, or finally admitting that the restlessness that has pursued you for years is not madness. It is a suffocated vocation. Carl Jung reminds us that there is no model for this. The process of individuation is radically individual. What is destiny for one may be a detour for another. Therefore, there is no map. There is listening. And fidelity to the path requires, above all, the courage to be unpopular, misunderstood, lonely. Because the price of living your own truth is often the rupture with others' expectations. But what you gain is infinitely more valuable. Integrity, vitality, a sense of presence that no distraction offers, an almost sacred feeling that you are finally where you should be. Not because it is easy, but because it is right. Living with meaning is not about being happy all the time. It is knowing that your pain has a place, your joy has roots, and your existence has direction. It is being able to look at life even on difficult days and feel that it matters, that you matter, and that what you do, no matter how small it seems, is aligned with something greater than yourself. This is the true healing that Jung proposes, not the suppression of symptoms, but the integration of being. Not the escape from pain, but the welcoming of the call. Not the blind adaptation to society, but fidelity to one's own soul. And it is precisely this understanding that marks the end, or rather the beginning, of this journey. Because now, more than ever, it is time to act. In closing, we conclude this reflection with a direct, firm, and necessary conclusion. A final call to reconnection. A reminder that you are not lost, just disconnected, and that there is still time to remember who you are.